Most people work harder every single year and still end up with almost nothing saved. And the painful truth is that working harder was never the solution. The game was rigged from the beginning, and nobody told you the rules. There are two completely different income systems running at the same time right now. You are almost certainly operating inside the wrong one without even knowing it. One system trades your time for money and stops the moment you stop working. The other system generates money continuously whether you work or not. The gap between these two systems is not about intelligence or education or effort. It is purely about which system a person builds their financial life around. And once you understand this single distinction, everything about wealth finally makes sense. In the United States alone, households that rely entirely on wages see their wealth accumulation slow dramatically after a certain income threshold is reached, because wages are taxed at the highest marginal rates, while returns from assets held longer than 1 year are taxed at significantly lower rates that structurally favor ownership over labor in every single tax bracket without exception. Think about what that actually means for a moment, because the government itself has written a rulebook that accelerates the financial advantage of owning assets over performing work, and that rulebook applies regardless of how skilled or productive or hardworking that work actually is at any income level anywhere in the economy. One of the most well-known investors in the world disclosed publicly that his effective tax rate was lower than his assistant's, not because of any illegal arrangement, but because the majority of his income came from capital gains rather than wages, which are treated as two entirely different categories of earnings under the law and taxed accordingly. Now here's where it starts to get uncomfortable, because a person earning $40,000 per year in a major city may spend 90% of that income on rent, food, transportation, and basic necessities, leaving almost nothing available to invest in any asset that could generate returns independent of their continued daily labor. Meanwhile, a person earning $400,000 per year in that exact same city spends a far lower percentage of their income on those same fixed costs, which frees a much larger absolute and proportional amount of money for capital allocation into stocks, real estate, and other income-generating assets that compound silently over time. Economists call this the savings rate compression effect, where lower income forces higher consumption ratios and therefore produces slower or zero wealth accumulation, regardless of how disciplined or hardworking the individual actually is. And this effect alone explains why millions of genuinely hardworking people retire with almost nothing despite decades of consistent effort. Here is the part that most financial channels will never explain to you directly, because the compounding mechanism only activates meaningfully when the invested base is large enough that returns exceed the rate of inflation by a significant margin over time, which means small investments at low income levels produce almost no measurable wealth effect across a full working lifetime. At an average annual return of 7%, $100,000 becomes approximately $1,900,000 over 40 years without a single additional contribution, while $10,000 under identical conditions becomes only $190,000. And that difference of $1,700,000 was produced entirely by the starting amount with zero additional effort from anyone. Let that number sit for a second, because this mathematical reality means that the earlier and larger a person can allocate capital into productive assets, the more the system generates returns that are completely disconnected from how many hours that person works or how skilled they are at their job, and the compounding simply accelerates on its own. Research data confirms that households in the bottom 40% of income distribution save less than 2% of their annual earnings across their working lives, while those in the top 10% save and invest at rates exceeding 25% annually, and that behavioral gap alone is responsible for outcomes that look completely different after 30 years even at identical starting incomes. Real estate follows the exact same structural logic, where a property generating rental income produces returns whether the owner is working or sleeping, eating or traveling, because the asset itself performs the economic function that labor would otherwise need to perform, and it does this continuously without requiring the owner to show up anywhere or do anything on a daily basis. The owner of 5 rental properties in a mid-tier city can realistically generate between $4,000 and $10,000 per month in net operating income with the right financing structure and occupancy rate, which is equivalent to a pre-tax salary of $70,000 to $120,000 per year, and that income arrives every single month whether the owner worked that month or not. Portfolio income through dividend-paying equities works the same way, where established companies distribute a portion of their profits to shareholders simply for holding a position in the stock, and the shareholder does absolutely nothing to earn that distribution beyond having made the initial capital allocation decision at some point in the past. Someone who accumulated $300,000 in a low-cost index fund and stopped contributing entirely would statistically receive approximately $30,000 in annual returns on average without working a single additional hour. And that $30,000 arrives not because of anything they did that year, but because of a decision they made years earlier. And here's the real paradox that makes this entire system so difficult to escape, because the financial behaviors required to enter the capital income system, specifically saving aggressively and investing early and consistently, are most difficult to execute for the exact people who need them most. The ones with the least margin for error in their monthly budgets and the most pressure on every dollar they earn. Researchers describe this as the wealth gap's self-reinforcing mechanism, where the system consistently rewards those already positioned to participate in capital markets while making it structurally harder for wage-dependent households to ever accumulate the initial capital base needed to enter those same markets. And this cycle repeats across generations without interruption. Breaking into the capital income category requires one of 3 pathways, which are inheriting assets from family, selling a business or equity stake for a significant lump sum, or maintaining an unusually high savings rate over a sustained period of many years while keeping fixed costs deliberately and consistently low even as income rises. The third pathway sounds simple, but it demands something most people are never trained to do, which is to treat every income increase not as permission to spend more, but as an opportunity to widen the gap between earnings and expenses and immediately redirect that difference into assets that compound independently of future labor. Countries with higher rates of asset ownership distributed more broadly across income levels show meaningfully lower wealth concentration than countries where ownership of productive capital is concentrated almost entirely at the very top. And this pattern holds consistently across decades of economic data, regardless of the political system in place. Policy researchers point to instruments like matched savings accounts, subsidized investment programs for lower-income households, and adjusted capital gains treatment at lower income levels as mechanisms for broadening access to capital income. But those policy changes move slowly, while the compounding gap between wage earners and asset owners continues to widen every single year. The S&P 500 has delivered an average total return, including dividends of approximately 10% annually over the past 90 years, and that return required zero labor from any of its shareholders. It simply arrived because capital was allocated and time was allowed to pass, which is the most important financial sentence most people never fully absorb. The core insight from everything covered so far is that the income system does not reward effort or skill or hours worked. It rewards position, and position is determined almost entirely by what a person owns rather than what they do, and understanding that distinction is the single most important mental shift available to anyone trying to change their financial outcome. Behavioral economists note that the psychological barrier to entering capital markets is as significant as the financial one, because people who grew up in wage-dependent households often lack the mental models needed to see asset ownership as something normal and accessible, and instead they see investing as something other people do with money that somehow appears from a world they were never invited into. The language used to describe wealth building in mainstream culture makes this worse, because phrases like work hard and save more create a mental map that points people toward optimizing their labor output rather than converting surplus income into income-generating assets, and optimizing the wrong variable with great discipline still produces the wrong outcome after 30 years. This is why 2 people can start their careers at the same income, work with equal discipline for 3 decades, and arrive at retirement in completely different financial positions, not because one worked harder or smarter, but because one consistently converted earned income into owned assets, while the other allowed lifestyle expenses to absorb every income increase they ever received. Financial systems in most countries are structured so that the longer a person waits to begin allocating capital, the larger the outcome gap becomes between them and someone who started earlier at the same income. And because compounding is a function of time more than of contribution amount, a 10-year head start at modest amounts often outperforms a larger contribution started a decade later. The practical implication of all of this is not that you need to earn more money before you can start. It is that the system responds to allocation decisions and not to income levels, meaning a person with a modest income who consistently allocates a portion into productive assets will outperform a higher earner who treats every raise as a spending event. The distinction between someone who builds lasting wealth and someone who earns a high salary for decades without accumulating significant assets almost always comes down to one behavioral pattern, which is whether they converted earned income into owned assets consistently before lifestyle expansion consumed the entire surplus. And that pattern compounds over time just as powerfully as any investment return does. Understanding this hidden rule does not require a finance degree or access to exclusive investment vehicles. It requires only a clear model of how the two income systems operate differently and a deliberate decision about which one you are actively building toward, because you are building toward one of them right now, whether you are making that choice consciously or not. If this analysis shifted something in how you see money and income and the system you are operating inside, then Phoenix Rafiz Finance is exactly where you need to stay, because every single week this channel breaks down the financial structures that most people spend their entire lives inside without ever once understanding the rules that were written long before they